Hello, today we'll be replacing the thermal pads and thermal paste on an ASUS RTX 2060 dual OC 6GB GPU. The product used will be a 50 by 40mm face sheet PTM for the GPU die, and then a minus pad 8 in 100 by 100mm dimensions, 1mm thickness for the thermal pads. For reference, these parts cost me $29 and then $27 in shipping within the US, so not great, but at least we have it. And for planning this purchase, I referenced an article on thermalpad.eu calling for multiple 1mm and 2mm pads, but I will be doubling up my 1mm pads, which I advise against. You should definitely buy a 2mm, but I was feeling cheap that day. To get started, we'll be undoing 6 screws on the back plates that engage with the front shroud of the GPU to form a clamshell. At which point you can now remove the back plate and flip the unit back over to get at the 2 connectors for the fan hubs and the LEDs. These connectors aren't too easy to remove as they both have clips, so you'll need to be a little nimble with your fingers or have some good pliers on standby. Now that the shroud's removed, we can flip the unit back over and begin detorquing and unscrewing the screws holding the heatsink in place. Considering the age of this card, the heatsink's going to be stuck on there pretty well, so I had to feel around a bit and just apply pressure in different areas without over-inserting onto the card. Eventually it did pop off. Now that the heatsink's out of the way, we can start to remove thermal paste and thermal pads from the unit. For removing the paste, I used a blue shop towel and 70% isopropyl alcohol. I would recommend a higher concentration, but whatever you have, as long as it evaporates, should be fine. And for cleaning technique, don't press down on the die at all, just use a good scraping motion, and it should come off over time. And absolutely do not try to remove the thermal paste that's next to the die on the board, or else you may pull up some of those small SMD resistors. We'll also return back to the heatsink and remove any thermal paste that may be stuck to that as well as removing the thermal pads. For cutting out the pads themselves, I just referenced the existing pad, as that leaves it a little bit oversized, and you can just cut it out a second time in order to get that double layer for 2mm when needed. Now you want to cut the PTM thermal paste a little oversized for the die, so it barely overlaps the edges. Now some general good advice I've seen for this was also cooling the PTM before you apply it. My PTM heated up during this process, so it didn't apply too easily, and you can see it got a little oversized, so there's a little bit of struggle with that. Now that everything's applied, don't do what I did and forget to remove the plastic from the thermal pads. I had to open it back up afterwards to remove those, so don't make that same mistake. Now's the time to remove those. Reassembly is a bit difficult as the heatsink rises up a little bit over the PCI slot, so I had to stick a small toolbox under it and rest the heatsink on top in order for everything to situate properly. With that done, you can now screw in and retorque the heatsink screws. Flip it back over and reinstall the 2 connectors. Fit the front shroud back into place, aligning it with the holes in the PCB. You now do the same with the back plate, put the screws back in, and screw it all back together. To judge the difference in performance after the modification, I ran a 3DMark Time Spy benchmark before and after the replacement. Here you can see the peak heating before the replacement had the GPU at 77.5 Celsius and the memory at 96.6 Celsius. Afterwards, the GPU drops down to 76.6, that's a difference of 0.9 Celsius, and the memory dropping down to 94.5 Celsius, which is a difference of 2.1. Now, these results were achieved in a non-controlled environment. It doesn't reflect the real-world performance too well. Regardless, I'm happy with the outcome, and this procedure will keep your card running happy for a couple more years.